Hola, so tani terang atsun tani opa, tani yami, tani nushokumayang kalakang sumduk, tani indi samala, tani gomo delakan samdujigin.
Tonight we have many Tibetans in the audience and Chinese people and some Westerners too. First, I'd like to begin by saying good evening to everybody here.
Tani terang atsu tani mamambo nyamdan zomni, tani samala, tani atsu tani chu toni, samala tani kabdashikin, tani shongwala, tani unetane tani sem pe meba tani gabo shonsong.
And I'm extremely happy to have this chance to engage in conversation with everyone on the topic of the Dharma.
Tani tambi chuze andana tani ngatso roa miru tani shertang tsangma tani ta tani longshot tani zu tani re tani ngatso tani poba yenanja tani gya yenanja nashoko mayenanja tani masatang sizina tani ngatso tambi chu toni shanna tambi chu tani nyambi kapsa tani chigto yewachi yomare.
When we're listening to the Dharma, in terms of the Dharma, then there are no distinctions between whatever ethnicity we are, whether that be Tibetan or Chinese or Western or whatever.
Tani sarji jumdun de chuzeanda tani shertang go roa simchin tamche pola tani to pantoya ta tani re ma to pa ta tinangla yang to chu murko yewandata yakub go yewandata tani chu ngaso ti pakaro ta no ho yewandata tani go yewa mambo yomare.
So when we're talking about the Buddha Dharma, it's really about benefit to all sentient beings, benefit to all people. There's no distinction drawn on the basis of a person's ethnic background or country or the color of their skin.
Tani ngaso terangyang dana tani to mo changma ngaso nyamdun zomni tani jayin nanda poyin nanda nshokoma nanda changma nyamdun zomni tani ngaso tani to ta khabdashya ti tani chude tani to ngaso changma la tani ta sizg tani nyanda nyan choya sizg nyamselin na nyamselin choya tani mo sizg nyamselin na sosorang ka semla tani pantongken ta tani zimbi gimsin jire.
So today we've all gathered here to listen to the Dharma. In this situation, anyone who wants to listen is entitled to do so. Anyone who wants to implement the practices, apply the practices, is entitled to do so. It's a situation of complete equality.
Tani terang atso tani chatchit go tani khapshang da kangrezena ta tapali garwa zya tere yana tapali ndeba zya tini zre.
So the topic of this evening's teaching is transcending faith or going beyond faith.
Tani tapali ndeba zikita ngatso kangriz la zega yorezena tani ngatso nangba ga tani chuto tani tapa kyangba ga tani thoni tani rogoya tani marezi kachares.
So what we're really talking about tonight in this talk is about going beyond just having a faith-based approach to our Buddhist practice.
Ina ngatso chudribna tani tapa go marezi ya tani tonda mares.
Of course, we're not saying that in order to be Buddhists we don't need faith. We're not saying that faith is not needed. Indeed, to practice the Dharma, of course we need faith.
Tani soso tani koa yakpo loyong yongken tenizi yembala teni zegore.
What we mean when we say that we can't, that we shouldn't practice just by faith alone is that in addition to faith we need to have a mind that sets to inquiring the Dharma, investigating it, and on this basis obtaining a proper understanding.
Tani chuzeata tani tendigo tani ta susu samlo tangna tani gimsen go toni tani samlo tang choba tenizi yin charti Tani nga zo zambalang ka sharshoko mayin nanja, nurshoko mayin nanja, musudang siz yin na tani to korang ka samlo tong shinkan ka tani yin tsarti, tani o tanda yang tabare samba ka tani kuwa ta tani susu siz kin na tani len tupka re.
The Dharma is something that anyone, anywhere, whether they're from the West or from Asia, can all understand through their own rational reasoning faculties. They all have the capacity to think and contemplate on the Dharma and arrive at an understanding of its meaning.
Tani tapa kyangbazi ka tohni tani tanro gonasi, ta nga so yin tamanda, ta tani yin gare, yichi go re, tapa shi go re, zikite ma tokpa, jamba tapa shi go wi gimsun shaki mena, tani karsang terang ka titsundala tani pe kakbores, tapa ki gonayang kakbores, chula lup gonayang kakbores.
So even though we might talk about the necessity of belief or faith, without knowing the reasons for, in fact, why we should have this faith, then in the current day and age, not having a reason-based approach makes arousing this faith quite difficult.
Tani namba ka tani chundela tani ta kanri rezina tani tokba mambo kina, tetsu mambo yona, tani jendi tetsu mambo yona, teli tenraz ka yakbo yore, sone tani songo yore.
In fact, the Buddha viewed doubts and questions as a very positive thing.
Nga so tani tapashi go re, tani tokba yona ndrika mare, tani tetsum yona ndrika mare, tani songo mare, tetsum chindanti gandhi tetsum mambo yona, tenji ka tani yakbo yore, sone namba ka tani songo re.
The Buddha never said that we have to have faith, questions and doubts are not permitted, quite the reverse. The Buddha was emphatic that doubts and questions, regardless of what they may be, are all to be welcomed.
Tani nga zon zambalang ka chu kangtang kangyin na, shirtang tsangmala mang ta tsangmala chu zindi tindi ka mang zi tani ta taka yore zi, tsangmala sharshok layang chu zega yore, nafshok ka chu lugin na, chu lugi zi pi mang ti tsangmala jikba rez.
In terms of the term religion, this is a word that's used to describe religious traditions in both the East and West. Religion is a word or a term that's used across the board.
Te yinna nga zo donga toni tani taga dan zambalang ka sharshok ka chu ta, nafshok ka chu la tani jikba yang yore, moshchik sa yang yore, nangdong ka toni tani njawa yang yore, manjawa yang yore.
But in actual fact, in terms of the content of religious traditions in the East and West, there are both similarities and indeed differences.
Tendri yenti tani ta nangba ka tani chuti tani taga ta kochi ni zhanda manjawa te chik kandere zena tani tokpa mangbo yo na tani yakbo yo re, zene tani zingre, pena tani sanje ka tani songpa yin nanja, tani zhamba ka tani songpa yin nanja, soso la te eyin mayin samje ka tani tokpa mangbo yo na,
so one of the distinguishing features of Buddhism vis-a-vis other religious traditions is that doubts and questions are considered in a very beneficial and positive light, whether they're directed against the sayings of the Buddha himself or against things that, or in respect of things that other people have said.
Yinayang teni tokpa te tangbo tokpa yogo gore, teni sasorang ka samlo tang shapa gyabni teni jini, te tokpa te par teni sarto gore, tokpa te par teni mebashi to gore.
Of course, we need to have doubts or questions in the future, but the aim is through our own process of contemplation and investigation to resolve these doubts. So our ultimate aim is the resolution of doubts.
Teni karte tokpa te par mebashi matang
Of course, if we're not able to resolve our doubts, then the existence of our doubts, the ongoing existence of our doubts, is not a good thing.
Perna tokpa chiktini saranga semka nala tokpa zikini, tani tokpa te par tani chud matang tokpa te mebashi matang tani shawa kandang kangana, tani ngatsu Nisechitela tokpa tata shina ta tinti shina enju munju ayin mayin samne tinti ndundu ke ma tokpa tani shawa kan le guna le thap maris.
If we have enduring doubts in our minds, doubts that we're not able to resolve, then it is a burden on our mind no matter whatever we do. If we are essentially acting constantly asking ourselves, wondering whether what we're doing is the right thing to be doing.
대인 살티 되니 가서 되니 다 똑바자와니 고 말에 되니 가서 답아치고 저거래 되니 답아 작고래 마 똑바 유년 그 말이 대충 유년 그 말이지나 대형 말이.
So we are certainly not saying that doubts are not permitted, not saying that doubts are not okay and that we just need to proceed with faith alone.
되니 양 똑바 요거래 녀석치 보텔라 똑바 딱딱거는 돈이 되니 내고래 태숨 딱딱고래 똑바 딱딱거 돈이 내고래지나 대형 판독요 말이.
But we're not saying at the same time that one needs to live completely on doubt and questions alone. This would be the other extreme.
더나 간티 고래지나 당보 가서 강당 강라양나 똑바 요나 약보래 똑바 고래스.
So what we are saying is that at the outset, in the very beginning, having doubts is a good thing.
되니 똑바텔라 삼로 만보 땅네 되니 똑바테 팔 메바시 탑소나 되니 약보ren도 그래스.
And that after having these doubts, by contemplating on them and thinking about them, eliminating them is what we really want to strive to do.
되니 때단 낭바가 되니 고랑 쪽 따바레스.
And this is the Buddhist view.
되니 가서 너쇼고 되니 르그네가 나라 되니 양 샬르그만다와 닌도스.
In terms of the Western tradition, there are two views on this.
되니 강레제나 되니 양 가시나 되니 다 똑바요는 그 말이지니 되니 샹크양 요레스.
There are some people who would say that doubts and questions in relation to religion are not permissible.
양 되니 가시는 되니 다 똑바 나와제 화이론제 똑바 나와제 되니 다 인담만다 똑바 딱딱 고르지니 되니 샹크양 요레스.
And then there is another school of thought, say skeptics, who view doubts and constant questioning as the way that people should go.
레데다 티톨랑아서 된디 고아 렌니 당보 똑바 요 되니 똑바 젯니 똑바 메바 셈탁천니 어단데 약보레 삼죠 소소란 거 이친거와 된디즈 요고레 마토바 데메나 되니 가서 되니 똑바 딱딱 고레지나요 데 짐슨 문도지 똑바 자와니 유년 그 말이지나 데 짐슨 요 말이스.
But the Buddhist approach is not either of these two extremes. It's not saying that doubts are not allowed, and at the same time it's not saying that we should have doubts only. It's about having doubts in the beginning, resolving them through our own investigation, and then on having resolved these doubts, generating a sincere belief and faith as a result.
되니 산지 샥자타파 되니 제아 톰바 산지 샥자타파 산지 좀든데데 코랑 오네 장네 코랑 가사가 뭐더 강레제나 되니 코랑랑라 타파신킨 레라우즈 그 산지 송바레 타티 인지리 삼니 되니 그 타파시 샥사도 산지 특기상오마테 코랑 가상오마테 테 마레즈.
So the kind of the Buddha in fact does not prefer a person who has an easy or ready faith.
원한 산지 코랑 가사 음용오마데 강레제나 산지가 송이나 데라 똑바시 삼로만보 땅니 데닝무니 땅니 닐글라 데니타가타 이친킨 그 모텔라 산지 가그레스.
So what the kind of person or practitioner that the Buddha in fact does value higher than that is the person who takes what the Buddha has said and really investigates it, examines it, critically appraises what the Buddha has said.
되니 디 짐슨테 산지 좀든데 그때니 도가나라사로 송요레.
And the reason for this, the Buddha clearly stated in the sutras.
되니 도 텔라 가리즈 그레즈나 되니 가우 마르든직 빔도 제니 되니 팍디 건가오 되니 마르든직 파파임나 심진남 되니 파마가 되니 머신이 지마드니 키와시마 마르든직나 컨디션인 지거레 손에 되니 그 로지샤사가 도즈요레 텔라 가우 마르직금 도즈요레 디나라 되니 송요레.
And the sutra in which the Buddha spoke on this is called Ananda's Instructions on Entering into the Womb Sutra.
되니 디나라 가리 손득제나 되니 산집 좀든데 그때니 건가오라 되니 teni kajan tenti songdu se ganga oze teni kyorang ge ta nga kyorang ge teni tomba yimba tang teni nga kyorang ge teni ta girgin yimba tang teni nga kyorang ge nyesa yimba tang teni si jimsen shini teni kyo ngarang la yin ma chi ya songde teni jimsen tu shini kyo ngarang la yi china yabo yo mare songde teni songdu se.
And what the Buddha said to Ananda in this sutra was that you should not believe what I say, or you should not believe in me just on the basis that I am your teacher, I am your guru, or for the reason that I am your relative.
Tana kandi gogorezina teni kyorang rang teni nge shapi kaja tela kyorang rang teni samlo thone teni takshit ji kyorang rang teni samlo thong takshit ji ta teni kyorang yichi yong gore ma to ba nge shapare teni yang tak ba injere samne teni kyu machi sone teni song yores.
You should instead generate your belief based on your own investigation and examination of the things I've said, not solely on the basis of the fact that I am the one who said it.
Teni kajati nani ta kari zege yorezena teni sangji chumden de teni songna ta pena sangji ge loma namla teni nga kyorang cho teni to girgen reze ta ti indi teni kyorang cho ngala yechi go reze ni teni song yo mares.
So what the Buddha was saying is to his students, you shouldn't just believe in what I say or believe in me on the basis that I am your teacher.
Teni nga kyorang cho teni tombare ne teni kyorang cho ngala teni yechi go rea nge zena te kyorang cho yechi go reze ni teni tsani song yo mares.
Nor was he saying, you should believe in me just because I am your guru.
Teni sangji ge sona ngarang ge shapa tela jimsun dukta munduk teni kyorang rang ge kale ji teni samlo thongda teni kyorang ge teni ha ko yong gore teni kyorang yichina ya boyo re sone teni song yo res.
What he was saying is that you, my students, need to carefully investigate what I've said and see whether it corresponds with reason. And if you arrive at an understanding that it does, then you can generate your belief in me on this basis.
Teni yendi teni ngarang so teni nangba ge teni ta lerka leluk te teni ta tsar ge teni ta lerka leluk ta nika teni lelu chikban ra pore tsar ge thone yenna korang ge jimchen yota meta teni saru tagne teni jimchen yona teni yechi jore ma to ba jimchen mena oda injere samne teni tapache ge mare tsar ge yang te re teni nga chu nangba yang te dang chikbaren dos.
So we can see from this that Buddhism operates in a way that is in accordance with the scientific method too. Science similarly works according to whether or not something has been reasonably proved, whether there is a reason or not.
Teni tendi yendi terang ngacho teni tapali garwaze goya te jimsen teres tapali ndepa tapali garwaze gui jimsen tere ma to pa tapa go mare te tondak mare.
So the reason today that we're talking about going beyond faith or transcending faith is precisely this. We're not, it should be clear, saying that faith or belief is not needed.
Teni tapat shirtang go reta ina tapas irate te mundu kanro go rezina takshit ti mundun go res tapa mundu takshit tin go res.
So of course we need faith, but what we're saying is that prior to faith we need to engage in investigation and examination.
Shirtang tapazina shirtang karela zegozina tapazina yichi tela zegorezi shirtang tapala mambo shati yoreta zu ti tapazina yichi latini tapazegorezi.
We often talk about faith, use the word faith, but really what faith is referring to, the core of this idea is belief.
Teni yechi guna teni ngaso kari yechi go jimsen kang guni nga yechi go rezena o ta sanji go songware te yechi go re on the chu na la songware te yechi go re teni sha teni mareze.
And if we're going to talk about why we should believe in something, we're certainly not saying just because it's something the Buddha said or that's what the religious tradition said. We're not suggesting that this is a compelling reason for the arousing of faith.
Teni tendi insarti teni namba sanji wa teni chula lojong shingang ga musginna teni pena tharik pagan ra poshini jimsen go goni tela jimsen dota mundu suso go samlo mambo tang teni soso mashi wate sola tokba mambo lang jwa mambo shini teni kale rang teni o tate rendu jimtsim do samni teni rang yichin ore ti yichi patela teni tapase gres.
So as a student of Buddhism, we need to proceed as a scientist would in their endeavors, and that is by doing a lot of investigation, doing a lot of inquiry, and judging for ourselves whether or not what is being said conforms with reason. And if we find that it does, then the belief we have in this can be referred to as faith.
Teni tinti teni tapatela teni namba la ti tapatela kareze ozena tela gimsin shipi tapa zeni teni zego yore teni ti tapata pe yakboya res.
And this kind of faith that we generate through this process can be referred to as a faith generated through understanding, or an understanding-based faith. And this is a very positive kind of faith to have.
Teni tinti tapata teni ngacho samala go res teni tapata yoga res.
And this kind of understanding-based faith is the kind of faith that we all need.
Teni tinti tapatela teni te shirb tang dambi tapa zena shirk tang dambi tapa zena teni gimsin yopi tapa zena chikpare o tinti nilu yongkang tapa res te.
So this kind of faith, an understanding-based faith, is a faith that possesses reason. It's a faith that is possessed of wisdom.
Teni tenji tapata ngacho masosola teni go res.
And it's this kind of faith that all of us need to cultivate.
Tenji tapata gowi gimchen kang resina teni ta ngacho garte tapata mesona teni ngacho machama gate sem kanala tongba ra otini to chayore tensa ta tensa ra poyo mares tapata sem kanala mena teni ngacho la tensa chikchi yo mares.
And the reason that we need to have this kind of faith is because if for some reason we lose our faith, then we are literally without any support at all. We are in a state of complete emptiness.
Tini tirip jogit pada tirip jirga pagan nangla tini nafshok pagan nangla tini kaja chiksha nyongare zin nafshok rigne gnani kaja ziksha bare kaja kangsha bare zina tini ngacho pamjur te yarge chimbo soni tini mutsama tini shikbo re sona.
During the 18th and 19th centuries, a view emerged in the West which held that as society materially progresses and flourishes, we will no longer need religion. And this viewpoint, finding its origin in the West, gradually spread to other places around the world. So as a result, there are many people now around the whole world, both in the East and the West, who embrace this idea or hold this idea that as the economy or as material life flourishes, we no longer need religion. This is written in many books. It's a pervasive view.
Tani tartanga su tirip nishi tsachik paga nangla mu tsangma la tini tirip jirga pada jorgi pala tana tini nga tso pamjurga toni halipa tini yargi song tsarri tana tini na ta terang nga tso tsangma la tini chu murgo zini tsangma ga semga nangla chu murgun kan tini zreyo go res kaja ti dimba yinna.
If this viewpoint were in fact true, then today, as we are in the 21st century with such a materially developed world, we would no longer be needing religion at all.
Rite terang acho tini sem ka dangla chu murgowa machat ta terang acho la dewi kyang chu gowa tini zgat nesir tini zreyoris.
But in fact, the situation we are in is not only one of still needing religion, but in fact needing it even more than we ever have.
Te cherezina tini ngacho tarta tini da ngacho tini shusoko tokla tini garwan rada manda mambo yores.
The reason being that actually in our society these days there are even more problems and conflicts than there ever were.
Tani mudang magwarla tani ta yang ngaso tani ta pansang chikla tani ta shamdang nyar jishi pandawo ta so mepa reni tani yang garwata tani mambo yongyo.
And in general, kindness and compassion between people is on the decline, and there are a lot of conflicts between people.
Tani manam ko tani sem ko nala tani deshkit ko chora te mepa reni te chama sem margir market patang mavdiwa tani mambo so tani je ko.
And there are many people who have lost all sense of happiness and exist in a quite unhappy state of mind.
Tani lo trikchir denshata tani gya nyugya ga tani konrorta tani ngacho manam ga tani semma ke paga nani so ta kani yong ga zena zaje me pata kongi me pata pamjur me paga thone yong yores.
In years gone by, say half a century or a century ago, the main reason for people's suffering or mental suffering was a lack of material necessities like food and clothing, etc.
Tani tarta ngachu tini ta sem ko thone te ngachu tini dungor mambo yong go chit tani zaje me khanda kongi me khaya tarta jambalang ko thola mambo yore ta yinayang mang chiwati tini za ngachu dungor to tini zaje me batang kongi me patang pamjur me pi jimsin ji mare.
Even though there are still a lot of people in the world today who experience livelihood, great challenges in terms of their livelihood, the vast majority of suffering is not derived from a lack of food to eat or water to drink or clothes to wear.
Tani yang nafshok ko tani sanyirig papa tani katak jan namgi yang kajak chikshan yore ti kajak ta pe jimsin yore.
A well-known philosopher made a very compelling comment on this.
Ti jimsin ti kajak te tani sarje ga tani somba tani ka chigre nindus.
And this comment was essentially the same in meaning as the words of the Buddha.
Tani ti kajak ti nala karisha yore zina tani ngacho musudang sayin na yang tani susu rang tani dopa zik tani ta rang semla tani ta ngupo kang zik tani rang pe na tani ta jichimbo rendo na da pon chimbo wangcha yoba tani rendo na da yana katak chanze rendo na da tani ti tondagla sem ganala tani dopa zik yone tani ti tonda tani sun ne tani ta nyamak chigla karti nguni kyorang shikbo yinna yana wangcha yoba yinna yana tani katak chan yinna tani re sonasi.
And this comment was in essence about if an individual pursues the desires in one's mind single-mindedly, whether that be for riches or power and privilege.
Tani karti nyama chigla tani kyorang kan do pata nguni tani tani nrip sona tani ta kyo langsang tani ta pena ngamayina katak de yona yakpo kipo re samne kyorang ka katak yona kipo yan sare sam ngamayina tani ta shikpo re sona shikpo chak sona kipo yan sare sam tani sam de re ta nguni tani nyama chigla tani shikpo chak katak yoba chak sona tani ta langsang tani ta tela nyangpo munduk samba jaga wuliao o langsang tini ta nyambo me pa tini ta market pa tini changdo ores kyorang kan do pa tan dripti tini langsang market pa changdo ores ni tini shayores.
So if in fact we single-mindedly pursue these things, have our minds or believe in our minds that by fulfilling these desires, whether it be for riches or status or whatever, then in the event that one day these desires, these dreams of ours come true, as soon as we fulfill our desires, they will immediately become extremely meaningless for us.
Tani ta ngaso perna soso tini dopa tini tini rang semla yopi kavs tini dopa te endrep ti tondagla tambo kavle jab ne tini kavle jab go re ti nerkamna tani ta korang tini ta dopa tan drip sona korang kebo yongre samne tini sam go re yenayam dopa tan drip ni tini re sonti tini lamsang o tini ta kebo mayongwa tini ta nga ngune ngama samba ta kebo ere samna te mayim ba te lamsang tini konro res.
So while at the point that one is still striving towards that goal, striving to fulfill that desire, one thinks to oneself that upon achieving it, one will definitely feel happy. At the moment one does actually end up fulfilling that desire or getting what one wants, then immediately the feeling of happiness that one would expect to feel, in fact one does not feel. It's lost and one feels quite meaningless and unhappy.
Tate pe jana kandi zena pe na nga cho tangbo tini nga cho changbo imbi ne kabna kandi sam kare zena ta nyamas chigla tini ngarang la gormo kaji gona yang kaji yoje tendi si chaksona tani ta ngap deke pusum chokbari ore nga peke bozi yengere nga mare pa chi yoje mare samne tendi sam kare nga cho ti gormo to maybe kapsa tendi sam kare.
It's like when we're in a state of poverty, when we're poor, we think, oh, if there were one day when I had as much money as I needed, when I was really rich, then I'd be so happy.
Tanita nyamas chigla ngoni tane korang la tani gormo gaji gona yang kaji yo pa tendi ga tani shupo chimbo zu chaksona tani ti kapsa tani korang ka ngama samba tar tani ta ngoni ta demo kepo resong ta mare pa chik me manyem pa chik me ta pensum chokswa tindi zu yenga orizena zawani yenga mare korang ka samba ta yenga mare ti kapsa.
However, on that day that one might achieve this state of riches, having all that one could dream of, then the happiness that one originally thought one would feel at this time doesn't arrive at all.
Teni ti monta tini koranga tini garirezi koranga ta nga gormo mambozo na nga tini keporendo ore nga deke pansum sobarendo ore sambi jimsun ta kangrezina ti kapsa tini koranga tini gormo yobati chindizi ha ko mareze gormo yo nyung manduze korang tangbore te na gormo kaze gona kaze yobati ndiz ko thola ko mutse gangbola tindi ga shigbo chak nyong mare mangyona ta korang ke po injire sambare ma to ba te ko chaji yo mare ti jimsin jires.
And the reason that in fact a person would have this belief that one would feel happy upon fulfilling one's desires is precisely because until this point one hasn't experienced the state that one's striving for. So if one's poor, for example, one hasn't known what it's ever like to be rich. So the expectation or the hope is in fact based on the fact that one has never experienced this state.
Teni nyamas chigla teni ta gormo mambo to yo ne teni koram shipo chak sonti teni ko lamsang shine o ta gormo mambo yo na nge hale pa ke pos yengere teni ta mare pa chichi yo ke mare samda ta tendizi yang re mandu tarong mare pa ta manduk pa ta manyem pa mambo ndu tarong yo dumur mambo ndu samba te korang ka ha ko re.
Yet when one eventually does become rich, then one very soon discovers that in fact happiness continues, suffering continues, all kinds of problems endure, and that money is not the answer to it all.
Teni te ha kongkante ti jimsen te ha kongkante nga son roa mi lorji gu thola teni mogni yores mogni gu ta ha ko res.
In terms of human history, there are two kinds of people who have arrived at an understanding of this way.
Ni to serezena chikto tini lortong cha ni ta ngabja ko kondu shong sanji shakja ta bagare korang te ha ko yore korang ko sung na la te chama tini hale pa saroshi ni sonja yore.
Well, the first person, individual who understood this truth was the Buddha 2,500 years ago, who in his teachings very clearly taught about how this truth operates.
Teni ni pa te teni ta nga so teni ta chabartan zamalong nurshogla teni ta charik pa nam ji teni mambo la teni takshif shini ta gormo yo na shipo chakna demo kipo rendu ta mandu zeni takshif shipi kaps teni ta gormo yo pa ta manam la dekhi yung mandu zeni teni mambo charik pa so shiore ni pa te teres.
And the second type of person particularly people in the West, and particularly, say, scientists who, through their own investigations as to whether, in fact, material flourishing and money brings happiness, discover, in fact, no, this is not the case. Despite our affluence and riches, in fact, we have not arrived at happiness.
Te rete yena nga tso teni ta nga tso chua kirgona teni te ngubu go mare gormo go mare te se mare se go re se karte mena gormo mena teni nga tso chua kirtab go mare.
Of course, this is not saying that we don't need material things, that we don't need money. Of course we do. How could we live our lives if we didn't have it?
Ta wonang nge kari se re se na gormo nga tso mena teni nga tso chua kirtab go mare go rete yena yang nga tso teni mon namji teni deshki demo ta kepo se ate gormo tata kana ne yongre samni teni samna te nora re se te se yo re se.
So what I am saying is not that we don't need money. Of course we do need so in order to live our lives. What I am criticizing is the mistaken view that money is the source of our happiness.
Tani ta nga tso zajime konjime tani pamjor tang chwala kangri yopi nerkabna tani nga tso dungar mangchi shuti kangre zena tani phoa ma gyagba ta tani lipo to ko dungar teres.
Of course, when we're in a state of hunger or thirst or living with inadequate clothing, etc., then the main cause of our suffering is based in these circumstances.
Tani ta nga tso pamjor yarje song tani chwala kangar me zaje konje kanga thola na kangar me pa tani kavs tani nga tso dungar te tani sem ko to ko dungar mambo teres.
However, after we've essentially satisfied these basic material needs, then the source of our suffering is basically to be found in our own minds.
Tani lo jada niga konror to tani nga tso terang raon tani mambo zala kacha te shana tani mambo tani ko along maris o kormo yona ta je longshu shigbo re sonata demo ke bo yengire te ta demo ke bo mayen baz kala yo to nduk manduk samne tani sam gres.
Of course, if 100 or 200 years ago I were to have said this to an audience like this, then nobody would have believed it. Everyone at that point in time would have thought that by reaching a certain stage of material enjoyment, then happiness would be sure to follow.
Ta terang aso tiram nish tsachik pa tani zala thonsarti tani kajan de shadna tani mambo z ka ote dembare samne tani tanglen shin rores.
However, now in the 21st century, saying something like this to an audience like we have here tonight, many people can in fact accept it for the truth it represents.
And
the reason that people can take on this truth, or there are two reasons that people can accept this truth.
Teni Jimson chikte kangrezena mamboz korang uni teni ta pamjur ko tone yarje sone pe pamjur shigbo chak sarwi jis teni korang ka teni pamjur to kola demo tang kepo mahang wa tang sem ko tola tarong yang dungmar mambo yo pate korang ka nyamnyung ko goni teni hakoni o ta pamjur yo na yang tarong nga chola jambaz go ndu ma to ba pamjur chigbo ndu ko mandu tarong sem ko tola dungmar mambo ndu zene te korang cho nyamnyung ko nga chon zambalang ko yarji son sarwi yarkab namji nane teni mamboz ko tambo hako re teni tarta nga cho sharsho ko la yong ko teni mambo te hako ndu ko cho nyamnyung ko go yores.
The first of these reasons is the fact that in affluent societies like ours, there are many people who have first-hand lived experience of the fact that even that once one has achieved a very a certain state of material wealth and enjoyment, that suffering is something that still endures. This is something that particularly people in the West, but also in other parts around the world, have really come to realize and experience for themselves in their own lives.
Teni Jimson nipati kangrezena korang so tanglin shipi Jimson nipati kangrezena teni nafshuk la teni charik pa nam ko myulo ngapchi thamba garang la teni jimjik mambo shini teni ta o bamjur te yarje sona teni ngaso mo teni gormo kachi zigona teni sim teni zikyo yong ndu ta mandu zene teni myulo ngapchi garang la teni ta jimjik shini teni mambo jimjik shi thari jis o ta gormo mambo yona ya teni mo sim ke bo yong ko mandu zene ta ko cho charik go ne teni ta de hwang shi charwares.
And the second reason that people can accept it is that after 50 years or a very long period of scientific research into whether in fact economic development or material development leads to happiness, it can be seen, or it's been proved, that in fact this isn't the case.
Tendi in sarti teni ta jemsen nipo te la teni nga so ta pamjo ya je son sarna ta chu go mare ka ke go mare zikite teni nga so dembaz mayem batang kaja te la jemsen me pata teni nga so tirim ni shi ta chi ba na la chama ha go sarares.
So, on account of these two reasons, people in our 21st century can understand that the statement that when the society reaches a certain level of economic flourishing, it no longer needs religion, is in fact a very mistaken and erroneous viewpoint.
Teni mur namla gormu ka tse yona te demo ke po tendi yongwa yongjire samde kita teni nga so norwaz rendus.
It is very mistaken, the idea that happiness exists in proportion to our economic prosperity.
Ngama teni nyohong la yena teni to chig ngap chi ngarjit ko lo ni zongte lo simchi thamba rang la teni khorang so mo gir ke teni yongbte teni dab nga zena rngalo wupe o yarji sondus.
For a period of 30 years from the 1950s in Japan, the individual income of Japanese people increased fivefold.
Yena koso mo nam ke teni to ta ti chowat on di pamjur teni yarji dabar nga yarji songre ta yena mo nam ke teni chowala tan drik song ta yak song ta nga chim song samji teni ge nawate chimbi nawate yar chongzi jang jichi song meng de darong yang zhe meng de darong yang de go de ngan ding dang meng de ten dang meng de samba ma to o tan drik song ta nga yak bore song samji sim ge toni so som do pa khang zho wan zho de zao ni yong meng de.
However, despite this rapid and fivefold increase in prosperity, really no one in society felt satisfied and content as a result. In fact, the need for further acquisition, needing more of this, more of that, only continued to increase.
Tene nga cho mir ki lorji ge thola nga cho roa mir ge mui rig ze kin di lorji ge thola noncher mambo tini ta leka noncher ke leka mambo le nyongare.
In terms of human history, a great deal of mistakes have been made.
So lorji ge thola ta na chokore zambalang ke tini kharshogla tin nabshogla yang de noncher ke leka mambo le ne tani jini chama wa ta tin jig mand Tendri shina ta demo tan ke boyong manduk sambate teni shine tata chama ga shi charwa tendri lorji mambo yore chama ha ko jires.
And whether or not it's history in the West or history in the East, there are many examples of humans reflecting on periods of mistaken action or erroneous thought and realizing, in fact, that that is not a good way to behave or act, decide to rectify one's actions or abstain from those actions.
Teni tendri indi teni ta chama gan teni ta ngacho teni dela yarje sona teni demo yong gore teni ke boyong gore samne tendri ge teni samlo gormu to yona demo yong je ta ke bo dechet pasum so ba yong jere samba ti samlo teyang teni ngancho noncher ke teni ta samlo mambos yowinani chigres.
And among the various erroneous thoughts or mistaken thoughts in human history, the idea that with economic flourishing so comes happiness is in fact one of these mistaken ideas.
Teni tate ko chari jis teni ta nga so ta machine de la demo dang ke bo yong ya zi kandis go re teni sam na teni ta nga so yang lam kha sarwa zi teni ta sam lo tang go re.
So after we've understood that this idea or this viewpoint is wrong, then what we need to do is search for a new path in order to, in the direction of happiness.
Lamka sarwa ziyati nguni tranishana lamka sarwa mare nyangba tiris.
Of course, by saying new path, actually the path is a very old one.
Tani nyangba ti kangrezina penanga so pamjur ko thone yang kala kansam yo. Tani ta so sim go thola yang tini tapa tang de so yang tini kala kansam yo ne tini sim dang tini lipo nika la tini yakbo z tini ta ran chowa ni de sim gun chowa dang lipo gun chowa ni ten jamnyim go go ne ro the pi lam kha te tani lam kha nguma te lam kha yang tak pa te bares.
And this old path is one where our material needs and our spiritual needs are kept in balance and they proceed together in a state of harmony.
Tani te sarwari manduzi te sanje shakjat ballo tongchani ta ngabja kuni shat sarwa te res.
And this idea is not a new one, it's not a new path. In fact, it was the path advanced by the Buddha over 2,500 years ago.
Yinayang mambuzla tini tuna te sarwareze. Kangreze na tasar ko koso shivare. Tela mambuzla samna te sarwareze.
However, to a lot of people today, this idea, this notion is indeed a new one.
Tendi yendi tini ngarancho tsama tini tanga khangba tini tini zigboyona, langkhor tini zigboyona, ngarkhanga nala gormo mamboyona, tani nga dekhi pasam sokbaren rore sambi tini samlo matang rochis.
So please, everybody, don't fall victim to the idea that with a big house and a nice car and lots of money in the bank, you will be happy.
Tani ngacho tini to pena mushchi tini to dekhi kanani tak pamjur tam dewa yongkhan tini dekhi to kangrezina tharpa nam ki takshin mambo shini tini jingre kangrezina ngacho dekhi kanani gacha chida yana gacha chonga te ngacho pamjur landrewa yore mato ba jambat pamjur landrewa chawane yomare zenitini shayores.
Scientists say that the connection or the amount of happiness that we can derive from our material things or our economic lives is probably only 10 to 15% of our overall happiness.
Tauna ngacho tini deshki kanani gachap ch yana gachap chonga tini ngacho pamjur landrewa yona tini tele jampi tini to yana gacha gupch yana gacha gachi kyarngat tani kanglandera yorezina ta pamjudera mare jambalandera yores.
So if 10 to 15, only 10 to 15% is linked to our material lives, then the remaining 80 to 85% is linked to things that are non-related to these.
Tani jamba de kangrezina tani ta pamjur mayamba ngacho tani jikting zambalandi tola tani yana simda yana nguputa tani matopa jamba yo marezi tani ngacho ngupu landera yon kang dekit gacha chita chongale mena tani jamba gacha tini gupchegam yana gacha gachi charngat tani soso simdam dira yore tele jambalan dira yotun yo marezi.
In terms of the possible sources of happiness we can have beyond material things, the only other option is happiness that we derive from our own minds. So for this reason, the remaining 80 to 85% of happiness is precisely that which we can generate from our own internal or spiritual state.
Teni lo nivya samja kongla teni zamalang nurshok teni to tam khipa khashi gazena ngacho deshkit zikit teni ngupo tone yong gore matok ba teni sem knangli teni deshkit yong go te zena deshkit tsawani mepazne deshkit ernin manitawa deshkit mesazne deshkit tsarare te tondra yomare teni shayores.
200 or 300 years ago, it was said by thinkers that
lo nivya samja kongla teni zambalang nushok teni khipa khashi gazena deshkit zikit ngacho teni ngupo longshok tone yongre matoba soso sem gnangla deshkit zikit sem gnani yong gore zena teni te mareze teni tsawani deshkit mesaz gnala ayotaware mato tinala deshki yomare teni zeyores.
So the idea that was put forth was that the origin or the source of happiness was to be found in objects or things external to ourselves in the material world, and that our own minds were in no ways to be seen as the seat of happiness.
Jete tendiga teni samlota teni ta norwayem bata ngaso samagta kale jeko jesa jexer tendro yore samloti norwares.
But of course, the fact that this idea or this viewpoint is mistaken is something that increasingly we come to understand all too well.
Teni ngacho terang teni jojindi nangla karindu zena teni tapalen depaze teni sargi teni chuto ngacho chuwa nangla kandi gone teni ta nyamlim shi gore zeni teni shayorin teni ti tholange tondakchi shakins.
Okay, so we're going to now come back to our topic of this evening, which is going beyond faith or transcending faith, and talking about how to implement Buddhist teachings in our everyday lives.
Tani nga tso gol goyachig yoreze, gol goyachig de kangrezina. Tani nga tso la tani dumar mambo tani te yongwi tani te sem ga thola yenda da lipo thola yenda da kantar tani dumar mambo tani yong de cinde mang chewati tani kandam dewan de zena tani nga tso ndopa sem ga nga tso ndopa de la yuang zje. Ndopa de la tani dewan dos.
So the one understanding that we all really need to have is that the source of our sufferings, most of our sufferings, whether physical or mental, is in our own desires.
Tani ndopate soso tani ndopate tani ta karta rang atso samlo tambayina tani tape na ngarang la tani langkhor yakboz tani langkhor mepi kaps tani ngaso ta ngala langkhor yona samgare mauto bata ngar langkhor jigbota langkhor kongchembota tani tu samgamare langkhor mepi kaps tani ngala langkhor yona sambin dopate yoris.
It's like, for example, when we don't, in the situation of not possessing a car, when we don't have a car, thinking that if I did have a car, if only I had a car, I would be happy.
Tani tsama langkhor ko ni ro yo kaps tani ngarang chubola langkhor ko ya mena tani sem gana la ma ke payung gare tani ngarang la yang tang ni chobo chodan jawa ga langkhor jo na nga kandi chubo yo samni tani ga samlo yung gare.
And if everyone around us, all our friends, they have a car and we're the only one who doesn't, then we feel quite unhappy and really wonder what we can do about this.
Tani nguni tani nyama chigla tani ngarang ga chobo chodan janda ga tani langkhor za ngarang la yo sona tani nga sem ga tola tani demo chubo rendo gare.
And we think that, you know, the day that I get a car and I can be just like everyone around me, then in fact I will feel very happy.
Jete ti demo chubo zeate chikshina tani lo shekhaz gla tani yongore chikshina dawa khashi la yongore chikshina zankhor chig mato yo mares.
Of course, the feeling of satisfaction or happiness that we might achieve on getting a car and being like everybody else really only lasts a relatively short time, maybe half a year or a few months or perhaps even only a week.
Ta teni ti jine tape na lo shekha dawasam yana zankhor chig jine kandre rendo gore ezena ta ngarang langkhor te ta jamba chama ga langkhor te janda inna chamyon jamnyim ra boinna teni ta ngarang la langkhor yore chama la yore samba chamma to ba ta nga langkhor yona nga ngama ina ngarang la langkhor chama tan rawo tin jona nga kandi ki boz yona teni sam kare ta te omare je ta nga langkhor yore samba tin rama ma to nga langkhor ndu ta nga ki bore sam ji dekhi ko chorwati dehnang da kitnang de ta ni omare ji ti kapsa.
After a, you know, given period of time, a few months or half a year or whatever, then we no longer have the feeling of happiness associated with having a car like all of those around us. It becomes just a normal part of everyday life, something that we take for granted, no longer a source of happiness.
Ta tini ti kapsa tini nga chu tobo khashi zla tini ngarang rang langkhor tele yak tele kungchi tele zig khashi jingda ninda samda jinda tindi z yoyona tini ngarang rang sem gana la marki pa chang gare.
And at this point, when a few people around us start to get cars that are in fact better than ours, more expensive than ours, more fancy looking than ours, then our unhappiness kicks in again and we do not feel happy.
Teni ti kapsa tini ta ngarang langkhor tani yoni ta ngake bore samba te mepa machat o ngarang langkhor te nge chobo chole langkhor le tini digren ta nge langkhor ndi dugbo kor go re samne teni ta ti langkhor to khorang la tini sem tele kyang marke pa chin ro res.
And at that point in time, one finds oneself thinking, oh, all of these people around me are getting such nice cars and I've just got this normal car, it's inferior to everybody else's, and in this situation the car that was once the source of your striving and happiness now becomes the source of your suffering.
tani ta kare sam gare zena ta nge yinda manda tini nge chokbo sogo tini langkor tin rawa zata yang na tele lakba nge nyogo te samni tani ta yang kable mambo javni titon la gormo mambo so kable mambo javni te shegare.
And at this point, one starts to think, well, what I need to do is get a car the same as everybody else, a nicer car, or even better still, one that's nicer than theirs. And in order to achieve this goal, one has to exert oneself, work really hard, and make a lot of effort.
Teni tenri yendi teni ngaso langkor la yang tenri re, khangba yang tenri re, teni ngaso lakba thola chitsud yang re, teni ngaso pesho tangya ga teni simchir yen na re, chircha yen na re, te yang re, teni khyamnang lan jok je jogya ga teni khyamche yen na re, chama tenri re chikpa re, rolik ti chama chikpa re.
And in fact, our psychology, the way it works in terms of this kind of process of desire and fulfillment is the same regardless of what we apply it to, whether it be our cars or our houses, the watches we wear on our wrist, the electrical appliances we have in our homes.
Teni ngaso tangrib ka rigni ze pat ze atela teni chun chimbo chiyo ba te kangre zena tangrib ka rigni ndi teni korang ka tabshi njata mandra mangbo la teni mnam gi ndopa te yar chimbo gongne gongdam pere ya tabshi te je yores.
And one of the really big shortcomings of modern and contemporary culture is that people's desires are continually fueled in all kinds of ways.
Teni ngaso zamlang ka sharshok la ina randare nafshok la ina randare ngaso mota lam khala teni kang di njemda kwangao njemda njada mandra mambo yarndu teni ngaso lokke ga nala yaran rosa ga lam kha tela yang mat sama lokke ga teni lokke gni karma shikanda ma to gugo marta tela yang teni njemda ndamda mambo yarta teni shini teni mun namla teni mu shigbu namjin chowa de gandhi yin teni ti gind teni tongu yores.
These days, wherever we go, whether we're driving in our cars and we see billboards and advertisements everywhere, even taking a ride in an elevator, we see elevators on the walls, we're constantly exposed to images of affluent lifestyles. It's constantly put before us.
Teni tendishi yondi teni ngaso teni mo jobo cho yena teni njemda te so ryong wi kapsa teni ta ngeyang tendi zinyogo ta ngayang tendi mushibo nam ko khamba tawz kana la dego ngeyang mushibo nam ki teni langkor tawa korgo samni teni soso ndo pa te yar deli jang yar teni kone kone peryong gres.
And so when people who are not affluent or don't have these things see these advertisements, then the desire in their minds to obtain these things, to acquire these things, only grows stronger and stronger in the belief that if they did have these things, they would feel happy.
Teni tendi in sorti teni ta ngaso ta tistagda pe nan churcha ng kholung kon korshine ta ngaso chig rak sarvi ne kamna yang remandu ta nga tele jang yags go ndugse te rak sarvi ne kamna ti jang ndugmundu ta tele jang yagbuz go ndugse ne tendi kholung kon korshine ndopa tendi ndogres.
And we end up being enmeshed in an endless cycle of desire and acquisition, and after acquisition another desire, a constantly endlessly rotating cycle of desire and acquisition.
Te mato ta nga chola o ta nga ndrik song ta nga yakbo yo song ta nge tele bastum she keman ta nga rang longshu she ne ngarang langkor nand khamba nand ta ngarang gormo te yo bandela longshu she ne teni ngarang longshu she ne ta de yen tele le jamba nge le man samni tendi korkup se sharti yo ore zena tsawani muschigla zambala go muschigla tendi korkup te teni yong yo mares.
And in this situation, virtually not even a single person in the world has the opportunity to just rest in contentment with what they already have and thinking that this is enough. I already have what I need and I don't need to exert myself beyond this.
Teni tarta terang ka nga chogon zambalang ka shartang namnika ka shusok ta kanda zerezena perna teni tan trcha nalan trcha chempu chikanala sonkor zena chilun o tendi mambo teni drigne teni ta chikor ne tendi yong yo andawo ta tendi zre ore ze tangsang ka teni zambalang ka teni zawlang da tendi zre ti nanin khorlo chik ta mandigni khorndigna teni khorlo jamba tamje boyang mongkor khamere chama dinin khornin rogo ores.
And so whether it's the West or the East, it's as if everybody is entrapped in this constantly spinning wheel.
Teni tis zawade kangrezena perna tambo tinin kollo korngan ko sonkor chilun tambo de kangrezena teni tambo rawote kangrezena teni tambo rawote teni ngaso manam kan dopa teres.
And what is essentially powering this wheel, like a water wheel, the energy that is fueling it is in fact our own desire.
Deyan songdi teni ngaso teni ta manam ko teni chu soso ko teni chowa desche tang dambaz teni eyong ko rewa jabni teni baba mambo le shawa mambo le ore tati tabshiti teni tasta ka tabshiti la nur yore tabshiti nur yore.
So this idea that by achieving these things, by fulfilling our desires, that we will obtain happiness, is this approach, this method, is in fact very mistaken.
Teni nga zon zambolang ka sacha mambo zigla korik teni torlang mambo temni chisangman tongya me patang teni namka ngombo teni tongya me patang teni nga zo khawik teni wik teni to tsangma teni me pati so tamji pu teni njingri ngamba te so gangne shongware zena te so tamji chi zawade teni ta nga zo ndopan dipshi yongware.
And so the destruction that we have wrought upon the natural environment and the pollution that we have created all have their root or source in our boundless desire.
Dendi yendi teni nga zo teni to ngone changlin chuwa teni matsin teni chi soso go chi demo tang kebo teni zi yong eyong samna teni nga zo ndopa koni kondem perate marize ndopa tela te tsanzin che go res.
So in order to really work towards happiness, we shouldn't do so on the basis of ever-growing desires. We shouldn't be going along the path of fulfilling desire. In fact, what we really need to do is be able to keep in check our desires to some extent.
Jete te nga zo ndopa tsawani go marize ti kaja marize ndopa tsawani me pazu teni nga zo yongtab go marize.
Of course, again, this is not saying that we shouldn't have any desire at all. This is an impossible proposition.
Teni nga zo teni tartan ra poina nga zo chama teni shuso teni shurur teni longshut teni ngubo ndaso la nga zo halepa teni dangjok chembo dangjok yichi chi te chi chak yores.
Where we are at the moment is at a point where we have an excessive esteem and attach an excessive importance to external enjoyment and material objects.
Teni soso teni ndopa te mar teni chanzin zuchena teni nga zo perna sonkor mambo chilun sonkor mambo korko yoate teni te kale koranda ore yongres.
So by keeping our desire in a little better check, by controlling our desires a little more, it's like slowing down this spinning wheel.
Pena nga zon chirchan chungkor zigina teni koram gyokpapshini teni mambong korojagna teni chirchada tsangma teni jombore tsabore yongres.
If the wheel in fact spins too quickly,
teni te tsapo mayem ba teni te mara jamu da ore gona teni ko kale korna teni korang teni trotsat kale mari yongres.
And if it goes too fast, then it starts to spin out of control. So by spinning it more slowly, we can bring it under better control.
Teni ten raposheni teni nga chun dopa teni yargi teni compare teni tangjagna chanzin mashina teni nga cho teni shawale ka nyamachila le ka mambo le go yore teni nyachik tisochik na la le ka mambo drib go yore teni nga chun chowa non shik teni chichi rores.
If we don't keep our desires in check, if they continue to grow in an unbridled way, then the amount of work that we need to invest to be able to satisfy these desires only gets larger and larger, and we have to exert so much effort in fulfilling them.
Teni ta ti kapsa teni ta pernan churkor teni khorjum jona chawa che wa jindu teni ngazo lerka mambo lergo teni to semganala market ba mambo yung chowala nonshik chembo yung ne teni ngazo chama sem market ni teni perna America ta ndinti pamjur yargiri ta yena semganala teni deski jeme ro yore semganala nat yung kan de jemang ro gimsen de deris.
So as a wheel that is spinning at a high speed generates a great heat, so too when we are operating at such a fast and stressful pace of life, then we too generate a lot of pressure in our minds and in our lives, and as a result our happiness decreases and our mental health also diminishes as well.
Teni tenji yembati gimsenteng aso tarta mambo zikateni hako yore jewe chesar tenji rek yore te yenna yang teni lagling katone sosorang kateni ngerwa chimbo tangyo mares.
This logic or this reasoning is something that an increasing number of people accept and understand. However, in terms of actually implementing it or implementing countermeasures in their lives, not everyone is necessarily doing this.
Teni ta lagling katone te changa chu te marang kateni marang kan chowa katone lagling la te tamna teni yakbo yung gare soso teni kable yang teni mepa te teni sem ko tola demo ki boyang yongya teni yung gare.
So what we really need to do is to be implementing, actually practicing these countermeasures in our life so that our the amount that we need to exert ourselves is lesser and so that we can be more happy.
Te maina teni ngacho ndopa ng khorlo tong khorne teni ngacho kable mambo jab ni teni chita teni mche zerate te tong re nyama sigla teni ngacho mambo sak ne teni chigyang longsho ki mayon ne teni rogo re chama ignin rogo re.
If we become too stuck in this constant cycle of desire, then ultimately we do this for our entire lives, but our lives are in fact extremely short. And one day, despite the fact that we've constantly been in this cycle, accumulating everything, ultimately one day our life ends and we have to go.
Di gimsen te yang chama hako yore ta yena ta mamboz ga teni to soso chowa ga toni laglin la teni yakbo mashina gimsen hako wa chamji phanto yo mares.
Of course, most people know this. A lot of people know this logic. It's not something they don't know. However, in terms of actually putting it into practice or putting its countermeasures into practice, the number of people who do this are much less.
Teni terang achonti nangla teni to boba hale ba mambo yo sares.
Today in the audience, there are a lot of Tibetans.
Teni ngacho teni bog sachala teni to pamjur
In Tibet, our economic standard of living is rather low.
Teni American rawon den diesel latini thoyona teni ta pamjur ko teni thone ngacho rikki mambo yore thongji mambo yore teni res.
Coming to America, we are immersed in a society which is affluent. We see so much riches with our eyes. We see it all around us.
Ta ti kaus teni chikshina teni ngacho teni ta ngacho ngama ga teni samlo ta tan rugmandu ta nguni tangni teni tan chowa deski tang damba zera teta teni pe ngacho gurmo mambo sokgo undu khamba chimbo chapgo nyol go undu teni langkur zigbo nyol go undu chik yona ni yona sam teni tishina teni deski ngoma te terendu ma to ba ngacho ngama ngacho bona yo pi teni samlo ta tang rugmandu samni chikshina teni ga samlo yang yong chaparis.
And maybe many people, upon arriving in America in this situation, feel that the way that we used to live in Tibet is in fact not the proper way to live. What we should be doing is really working hard to make lots of money, invest in cars and houses and that kind of thing. Many people may find themselves rejecting the way that life was led back in Tibet.
Teni te khayo mareze khame pi gemsang kang reze na ngazo bobayen na ja mur gandang kang yen na teni musdang se na teni tangbo teni changbo yin bi ne kamna teni lower the hot ka chi teni te gormo mambo yo teni ngubo mambo teni yo sa teni zela te lebsona teni chama ga teni ta chi ngubo mambo te yo na te yak boyen sare samne teni tan chambalang ga mo chama ga sam gares.
Of course, this isn't to be blamed. You know, any kind of person, people everywhere, going from a state of relative poverty to all of a sudden having access to all kinds of unprecedented wealth, most people would believe that these are things they should pursue or that these are things that will bring happiness.
딘디그 삼로즈더니 삼바즈 용나 때 크고 문득다 있나 때 덴바레타 마리테 김슨 요레타 요 마르스나 때 김슨 요 마리 노랑 오마티 테레 마토바 마초 나마 삼로티 노라 마리즈.
While this kind of view may not be unreasonable, nevertheless we need to look at whether or not it is true. In fact, whether the idea that material accumulation will bring happiness is in fact not true, and it is not true that the way that life was led in Tibet was inferior.
Tani habta kachi kolmo mamboza tani lagla yung jana tani ta kanti shego moko ne tani khamba zigbo japche langkhor zigbo nyoji tenjita ngacho tani gorwo pamjur kyobo yung khanga mata sola tenji ga tani ta hajang mambo yongore te pobachi bo mare salayana yongandus.
Of course, there are lots of people everywhere, anyone really going from a state of not having much to all of a sudden having access to a lot would think that the thing to do is buy a big house, invest in cars and pursue material accumulation.
Te rete ti samlo to tini to norware karte ti samlo ti jis sona teni nga so ngune tane nyimasila demo chipo yongi korkoza yozena te me tacho res.
However, this kind of reasoning is extremely mistaken. And if we think that pursuing this kind of approach will one day bring us happiness, we're extremely, extremely in error.
Jetete nga so teni pamjur go mare nga so choyar jinro go mare ze ti kaja mare ze to go rete yina ta hachang ti tak la teni samlo tan ti chipo te ma to jamba chi ka ke samlo tan me pa tin chaksona teni ta nonchur ngomati tinani yongres.
Of course, again, we're not saying that we don't need to have an economic basis in lifestyle or that money is not important. However, if we solely devote our energies and efforts to making money, then we are bound never to achieve happiness.
Tindi yen sarti tini nga so perna tini ta America la yongna tini ta soso tini chi khangba yen na ta langkhor yen na ta tesu yo go reta yen na ha lepa tini ti
So whilst in coming to America, yes, people need a car, they need a house to live in. By focusing too excessively on these things is not good at all.
Teni nga so popa teni ngama teni samlo te nguni tane teni ta nga so tirim ni sa chik pa nga la ta yona te hali pa nguntung ko samlo rendoze.
Actually, our traditional Tibetan approach to these things, when looked at from the point of view of the 21st century, is in fact quite modern.
Ti gimsang ka rezena tini nga so pok tini ju murk ti hali pa tini ju samji ma pa yin bi gimsang rezena mareze kang rezena nga so samlo ti so sama sarje shakya ta pa chu na ne yong bi samlo yin bi gimsang ki tini nga so samlo to hon ton resong rez.
The reason that this traditional approach of Tibet was in fact such a progressive one was not on account of it belonging to the Tibetan people and therefore being so wonderful. It was the fact that this approach of the Tibetan people was an embodiment of the Buddhist teachings, and on this basis it was so progressive.
Teni nga so sowa kersate Amerikalan sowa kerna teni samlo to teni nga so teni ngama ga teni samlo to tithone sona.
So what would be really great is if we led our livelihoods here the American way, but kept our values and viewpoints in accordance with the traditional Tibetan approach.
ngaso pagpagam dok manjawan rawota tini chi tini yang tini chi tini yewa mambo shini chi gyata pota tini nafshok ze andawata ta tini yewa mambo re ma tokba shertang mu thamchi ku tini sim ku samlik ta so muyin sarti chama chik baris.
And this idea is not something that Tibetans alone should just pursue. It's something that's equally relevant and equally applicable to all people, regardless of what ethnicity they are or what the color of their skin is. It's an approach that is universally applicable to all humans.
Tani ngacho tani ta ngune tani tani demo ta ke boso rang la deschit yongwa ti gemsung ngomati kangrezena tani chukshi ge samlo o tan jikend ta nga ya bo chanson tan de dis nga rekend tele go mandu sambi chukshi ge samlo te rendu sing ngune tani ge deschit ke chora yongya ngomati te rendu.
Really, what the ultimate source of our happiness is knowing how to be content, knowing when it's enough, knowing when we already have what we need. This sense of contentment is really where our happiness will lie. And this, of course, was wisdom known long ago in our religious tradition.
Teni ngarang la samlo tambay na tambo tini chula lojong shi pinekamna o tini chukshi zirati tini ngacho tini dewa tsama ga tsawari zi tini shayo pati ngacho la lojong shi rita di kapsi ngacho kare samze na ina tata ngacho chi ti chabanda tata ndiza yingi re ma to pa tsama ta ina andra sambo tini samlo ngacho yang tambo lojong shi pinekamna ngarang la yang tini shiong songze. Ti ngacho shirta ngacho chugo nangla tini chukshi zeyati tini ngacho tini demo kyopo yongya ga tsawang ma te teyin songni songyo rezi. Tini ngarang rapola samlo tangna ngama lojong shipi kapsi o ta chukshi zeyati dewa tsawa yong zeyati ngacho chabanja raptu shunganja te tinjinja yingire o ma tokpa tsamata tinji yin sam songze.
So the idea that contentment is the source of all happiness is something that many people, and in fact Khenpo, when he first began his studies, thought that was something that was only really applicable to, say, monks or people who were in renunciates.
Tani tarta ngacho tani taga tan zambalang ga sharshok ta nashok tani lorji mambo ta tani manam ga semkham ga tani gerwa tela tani taga samlo mambo tang tani mambo ta tani she yondi o tang uni tani taga te rapshong ta trapa kyambas ga tondak remend musla yana te rendus.
However, now looking at the situation of people everywhere, whether in the East or the West, we can see that this is a wisdom, or that this is a kind of logic that applies equally to everyone anywhere.
Tani tanga tsum dopati te tsanzum she gona kandi tsanzum she go rezina tani ngacho gum gyab go rez gum gyab ni tani soso go sem kana dopati te tsmar chongyan rawo tani she go re te gum ma gyabna ngacho domban don ya chipota.
If we're going to go about reducing our desire or keeping it in check, then we really need to engage in meditational practice. Just doing recitations alone or prostrations, etc., is really not going to help us to bring down our desire. Everybody here tonight, I hope that you can really take this to heart. Lay people, lay members of the community need to practice meditation. And the reason that I address this comment especially to the Tibetans is because back home in Tibet, not many members of the lay community do engage in meditational practice. A lot of people think that meditation is something that monks and lamas do, and not that it's not an activity that lay people engage in. This is in fact nonsense. It's completely not the case, and everybody should engage in meditation practice. Well, it's like if a lama eats food and feels full as a result, but you're not eating full. If you're not eating, then the fact that the lama's full is of no benefit to you.
Tini lama tsogo gumjab na korang so gumjab re mata pa choso gumjab mulgo pa jimsen chichi yo mare.
And similarly, if a lama is practicing meditation, then that is his thing, and the benefit is his. It's got no relation or to your own meditational practice.
Rete te choso kyun mare zi, cho marcha pomo kyun re mandu zi, te chere zi na te lama so par kobda tra gore ta te kobda master pare te choso kyun mare zi.
But of course, this isn't your fault for thinking like this. This is actually a failure of the monastic tradition and lamas to communicate this properly.
Te ngarang so kyun re ndu zi, nga so choso tindi gumjab go re nyamlen she go zi, tindi lab mandu wa zi, te lab me na nga so kyun re zi.
This is in fact our fault. It's our shortcoming. We haven't told you that you need to practice. We haven't instructed you to meditate.
Tini choso teni ta gumjab go jinda nyamlen she go anda te so hamago na te khayo mare zi. O ta marcha pomo go samare, doso sama lama so lekin sare nga so da go samare samna, tindi samna te khag mandu zi, choso khayo mare.
So for this reason, you're not to be blamed for feeling that you don't need to meditate or that meditational practice is not something that lay people should engage in.
Rete ta te tarnga kang yin na yin, ta panchut ni nga so sama te girchu gyamni, teni choso go yinda mada gumjab lojong yakpo chi, teni lojong chi, nga so nangba ga teni tawa tang shopa ta gomba nso la lojong yakpo chi, gum yakpo gyob zi choso go.
However, this is how things have been in the past. Now, at this point, we really need to reform the way things are, and from this point on, everybody needs to study the Dharma and engage in practice.
Ta tenjawas ka tini nga so yang nang la yang tini ta chu nyamlen shipi ne kamna chi tini puncho ya nda ota chi tini te soran dam ne tini ta tini ra ma to pa gum mjam kan ka tini chupa yang yin kan tini chi te gum yang mjam kan tini mambo yore te yang jka mare gum jab go re tini lojong she go re gum jab go res.
And this advice also applies to, say, Chinese people who also don't engage in meditational practice, just making offerings, incense offerings, supplications to deities, etc. Everyone needs to engage in meditation.
Tini navshukla nga halipa charji yo mare zi nga hame charji meta yinang par nyanna par chir tini navshukla maso tini tawa ta tini chula tini chu lojong she jinda nyamlin gum gyab jinda te so gabo yore zi tini zegandu tini na pe yagbo re tini go re zi.
And I don't have an excellent familiarity with the situation in the West, but I've been told that Westerners do engage in study of the Dharma and do like to engage in meditational practice. This is very good.
Ta tindi shi ni nga so te gum gyab ne so so ndo pa te la te zi chanzim she ji te tini nga so ta demo tang ke bo yong ya ga tini chowa ga na la nga so nambi chu tini ka ti nyam se len zina te nyamling she sir ga thab shi chik te re zi.
So by doing meditational practice is one way that we can work on reducing or keeping our desires in check so that our lives increase in happiness.
Tani thapshi ni pa te kang re zina tani nga so tani ta chowa ga na la namgin tani ta jan la pan thoya ga samlo te la tan namgin nga so samlo tong go re zi.
And the second way that we can increase in happiness in our lives is by really working on engendering the altruistic mind to be of benefit to others.
Ta ti thola nga so tani poba chola na te zi ji yakshu nda yakbon da wo yang chi yo re zi.
Actually, in terms of this, Tibetans are quite good.
Yakbo ta kang re zina pe na nga so terang da boy na ya ta nga so sama ga tani simchen thamche pola tani ta tani jampang ka leka le go re jampang ka samlo tang go re ze ni tani shanna tani poba zi na chama o te go re zen ken zu ma to ba te kan ri go re nge te go wi jimchen chere ze tani zen kan yo ma re.
When I say that Tibetans are quite good in this respect, I mean it insofar as, for example, tonight, if I talk about the need to be of benefit to other people, the need to be of benefit to other beings, there would be no one among the Tibetans who would question why this was necessary or, question whether or not this was a sound approach.
Ti nga cho go rigni tang, tani nga cho go lama tang, tani 파마단 뜻소 과정레스.
And the fact that there is such widespread acceptance of the need of this approach in the Tibetan community is due to the kindness of our parents, of our culture, and our lamas.
당아서 김성 그 돈에 르피 종르 그 돈에 가서도 고그레 잔라 판바 체고레 잔라 판바 레카 레고레 삼로 땅고레 땡아서 켈랭그리타 옛날 동고 우보 라랭 그 돈에 가서 알디야볼 대지 용고 요메 참아요레스.
However, whilst there is widespread acceptance of the principle of needing to be of benefit to others, whether in fact in actual practice people do this is something that there may be a greater discrepancy in respect of.
근데 인디티니 다 판청가 주직도 디토라 삼로 땅니 참아 되니 잔라 판바가 되니 직되니 다 삼로 땅야 잔라 판바가 레카레야 잔라 판바가 까자샤야
So from this point onwards, everybody should really work towards being of benefit to others in terms of everything they do, from the thoughts that they harbor in their minds to the words that they speak and the actions that they undertake with their bodies. And this is advice that applies again equally to everyone, regardless of whether they're Tibetan, Chinese, or Western. However, in this respect, we do have a mistaken view.
Jang tondagla tini samlo mawtang leka male rang deya tang keya ga leka te lena tani rang demo tang kepo yongre samne tindi ti samlo changmala yores.
The mistaken view is that we are so self-oriented, always working for our own best interests or our own happiness, feeling that in the belief that by working for these things that our own happiness will be generated.
Tani khabar danga zo tangsang tani zambolang ka nil shok la yang re shar shok la yang re lobja nang ka tani te lobso to so nang la ta ti pe na rang tini gormo ina rang mawa te rang tini thoya ta tani chi shawaz leka zle na tani shawa yagpo to rang thoya ta tinji go thola samlo ta ne tinji go thola thapshi tini shiluk tani rigpa shir tinji tak tak lob go yore ze tini lobja so nang la.
And a large reason for this is the kind of education that is delivered in schools these days, which teaches people to pursue knowledge and other things, their careers, etc., all for their own interests.
Tani example ala tini to shikin chimbo yongken ko tini pe na chapter ko tone jarko so zhenzhen ja boda tani 환줄 그 돈에 되니 지금 단 잠발랑 그 되니 또 또든 그 총바 납자세 한다고 든지世界500强 든지 자오다 되니 지금 다 사르 받아 또 상마되는 잠발랑라 시킨 첨부 용컨도서 소단도 소는 용고요레스.
In the world today, the most influential and powerful people in political realms, economic realms, the richest, the 500 richest people, etc., are all graduates of higher institutions of education.
Teni lobtan so nani teni jampam ko teni samlo to teni to loso yakbo jab kapshok yakbo mashina teni mot so lobtan nani thon charu nirkamna hale pa nipa chepo yore teni korang rigpa thabo chammo teni yore rete mambo zala jampam ko sambate yomaris.
But the education that they have received in these institutions means that even though they are extremely intelligent, when they graduate, unfortunately, they don't have a particularly strong altruistic mind of benefiting others.
Tanita, jambang ko teni samlo te yongken da to so changma tanita ta nipa jig menken zambalang ko thola teni shikin menken.
And it will become a situation where, in fact, those people who do, in fact, have a mind to benefit others are those who are the less powerful or those of lower status in society.
Tani zambalala shikin chepo tem zambalang kalu gir tani zambalala wang gir tani shegen dengken taso tani lobja na ne yong tani lobja na la jampang ke tani loso me tani ri chati tani nga chon zambalang thamche po tani jan la samlo motang kan so ger la samlo tang kan rang la samlo tang kan tak tak ren do re.
And as a result of this, people who do go to good schools and go through the education system, as a result of not receiving proper education in altruistically benefiting others, become people who think of nothing but themselves and serving their own selfish interests.
Tani tendri ge samlo ta mepi gemsenji tani nga cho tar nga yin na zambalang ge thola tani chin amang thik ram mambo yone tani the chagol pe mambo tani shi charre ta maumba na tendri mayong se kona pe kharbores.
And it's precisely because there is this lack of an altruistic mindset and a very selfish set of values that prevails that we have a situation in the world today with so many wars and disasters taking place, and it's very difficult to see this situation becoming better in the future.
Tani zambalang ge tani thola tani nupshuk la yin na tani nupshuk chi yarji ta nguntun ta chi samlo ta kang ge thone yin na nguntun re charwan da so yin na lorji ge thola ta yin na tani tani ge jampang ge samlo ta mepi gemsenji tani ramnyim mayim ba da tani ge lehka pe dgbo tani choshu mambo len do wazi.
So we can see that in the history of Western countries, which are today very economically ascendant, etc., that in the course of their histories, all kinds of actions have been undertaken which contravened equality and were not in the interests of others.
Tani tarong yang tani maong ba na ta nga chu tindi che ge mare ze ko na pe khabore tarong yang tindi yongwa ge nyinka yores.
And to say, well, from this point we're not going to do that any further is extremely difficult. It's entirely likely that this behavior will continue.
Tindi yendi tani jampang ge samlo ze ati tani nga chon zambalang la tani nguni tani ge demo che po yongya ge sa ngomati tere te na te nga chu sangma ge tani ta thomar ha ko go res.
So it's extremely important that everybody realizes that having the mind to benefit others is in fact a primary cause of happiness.
Tani ha ko wa chamji tani chokoyo mare tani nga chu nyamlin she go re laglin she go res.
And knowing it is not enough. Having understood it, we really need to put it into practice.
Tani laglen che na tani ta gandhi che go re zena nga chu tari kong do shapi ndopa chunjun she ya tela tani nga chu nangba ga nangla tani ngimjung gomba zene tani gomba tindi yore te gom go re te so gum jamna tani yakbo yong gore laglen yakbo yong gore.
So in order to do this, we need to work on reducing our desires, and in order to do this, we can meditate on cultivating renunciation.
Teni nipati teni nga chu teni ta shamdang nyangji teni gomsar teni nga chu nangba ga teni thakpa chimbu chu nala sham nyangji gomban rawo ta shangshim ko sem gomsar teni ga teni ta gom nyamling teni shya teni pe mambo yore teni ta tso tezi changma ga nyamling she to mo to ta go re.
And in addition to meditation on renunciation, in the Buddhist tradition there are also numerous meditation methods on loving kindness and compassion, and these are methods and styles of meditation that everybody would be urged to learn.
Tendri yendi teni soso to ti thola sanlo tani nyamlin te chu she thamna tani soso chin di thola yang ke bo yong gore che shimala yang ke bo yong gore.
And if everyone were able to engage in these practices, then not only would they achieve really some real happiness in this lifetime, they would also be sowing the seeds for happiness in future lifetimes.
Tani mat changma ga soso rang ga tini ta te zu tini che to janla phan thok che ga tini je pamjun ra tini ga nipa yo na tani pamjur ko thone janla tini to phan thok pa tini gorwo yin na tani che tini 교보 tini 간디였나 tini tsola tini 판테 zu toya la thola dang jab go re gormo mambo me na kyong mari te zu nyong le me na ta te yin na tini so samba choya re te pe yabu yo re.
And in addition to this, if people have the financial capacity to do so, then acting to benefit others in the society, people in poverty, etc., is a wonderful thing to do. Of course, one doesn't need to be rich to be able to do this. One can exercise this generosity in accordance with one's situation.
Tani karti tani sosola tani pamjur ko thoni tani ta jichimbo mena takashi ko ta ngata pamjur yo mare nge jampang le ka le thap ko mare samna te mare ze jampang le ka le azi ki te pamjur yo na pamjur ka le na chokore karti pamjur mena tani soso ko tani jampang le ka le na gansa kan la ya na tani lesser mampu yo res.
Some people might think that if they don't have money, then they can't do actions that are of benefit to others, but this is absolutely not the case. In addition to being able to benefit people in economic ways, there are a myriad other kinds of ways that we can be of benefit to others.
Tani shertang nga so nangba ga tinin to nangla yena nangba sanji pa ga nangla yena pharu to shimba drigze ni ju jimba jin ya ta to so thola tini shyakye kha ga mangbu su shay yores.
In the Buddhist tradition, among Buddhists, we talk a lot, we give a lot of lip service to the importance of generosity in the 6 perfections.
Yena dong thoni te nga so ngoni te chi pe na yishi chulung ra on so na tini pe yabo tini to shiso ko tini to so la phamba de ya ra ta shipang ga le ka tini ko so mambo ngama yang mambo lendu tarta yang tini mambo lendu tinja oz tini nga so tini rigbi jonlu ko thoni mambo shay yore ta yenda nga tini to lagling ko thoni mambo tini to leche te te nyong ra bores.
However, despite the amount that we go on about the importance of generosity, we have not necessarily put it in practice to the same extent that other religious traditions have, such as the Christian tradition, which has engaged in beneficial work for others in society in history, and it continues to do so today.
Tani nga so ta ngarang rang de tini demo ta che po yong ya ga samlo ta ne tini shedan na ngarang demo yong sambi samlo tin norware tani ngune ta ni rang demo che po yong ya te gare zena ta jian namla tini demo che po yong ya te nge kanti she go ze nge jampan ta kanti drab go samji samlo to nam tini samlo zo yong la tani so rang tini demo che po ngo te tini tsig bares.
Often we think that our own happiness, that happiness is going to be fulfilled when we are able to fulfill the things that we think will bring our own happiness. In actual fact, the true cause of happiness is when we start to concern ourselves for the happiness of others.
Tenti yendi teni ti thola ta so teni gum nyamlen teni yakpo che tenti yona te karchim bore na te na so teni ta tela teni semna lan jang go re je te yenda nga so gum jawya te 당보 nga so lojong che go re ma to pa lojong ma she na teni gum kandi jab go re teni thomr lojong che go re.
So engaging in meditational practice will be of great benefit to us. But before we do this, of course, we need to study and learn about what we're meditating on and why we need to do it.
Teni nga so terang dana yo pa ga teni boba yang mambo zu teni boba chula nga musir ko tondak sim sha ki yos.
So tonight there are a lot of Tibetans in the audience, and I would like to raise 3 points in respect of you.
Teni ton boba main na shirtang mi longba na la denken ko murgzgin na sin na rapore boba chipo main na jamba yang teni gogres.
Of course, these points are not just relevant to Tibetans, they're relevant to anybody here in the audience.
Teni tondak simti na ne tondak tangbo de gare zena pe na nga so boban da na rang teni sane teni thon ne mi longba pe na America tawaz la ding na ja Europe tawaz la ding na ja yana sacha jamba la ding na ja gang dang kang la ding na ja dorna rang fire ne yong ne mi sacha la dengking go tindi go moz yin charti yinda manda tondak simte la teni to samlo tang go res.
So the first point pertains to or relates to Tibetans who have arrived in another place, like here in America or in Europe, but also to anyone who finds themselves leaving their original place, their homeland, and living in another place.
Teni tonda tambo de kangrezina teni nga so America la yo na da sacha jamba la yo na da gang la yo na da tini sacha tela yopi tini chumdang tini sacha tela yopi rigni dang tini sacha tela yopi tini to lichur ta tsola lichur dang tsola tini to zunjok yang tak ba tini to che go re yang tak ba chung go re ze pena chum yak bo chung je da tini so so gon tini pena lichur ka de kang yo na tso lichur to so tini to yak bo tini she ne tela zunjok yak bo she je te go re.
The first point is that the importance of respecting the laws, cultural practices, and traditions of the society we newly find ourselves in.
Pena America tawlo na mo karbo yang tu mo nakbo yang tu tini te pena so la rigne mo karbo rigne na mo nakbo rigne na mo serbo ngason ra otela mo serwo zegere mo serwo rigne na ja rigne kang kang na ja tini tapa yang tini te America te tapa jada manjang yore tini na khorang chu chul tapa kang shinken zegena ti tapa te chola zunjok yak bo che go gres ko chu zunjok yak bo che go gres.
We need to be able to exercise respect to the different cultures and cultural backgrounds of everyone in America, those cultural practices of white populations, black populations, yellow populations like ourselves.
Teni soso teni te lichur kandang ko na tesola zunjok ya bo shi ji dang teni pena Tana teni samja yen nanja gandang kang shone yen na teni ta sacha te tam thumbu yakbo su she go re ma to sacha te tam monthon ba ta mo te tam monthon ba teni chang she na teni reg mares.
And in addition to having respect, for example, for different religious backgrounds in society, we also need to respect the different customs and practices that are prevalent in society. This is the first point I'd like to make.
Teni tonda nipala teni ta mo rgni la teni sunjuk she go re te inna rang rgni ti inda manda teni ta tambu zone teni ta mar manyam ba ta teni ta ginzn yak bo she go res.
The second point is, while respecting the tradition of the new culture that we find ourselves living in, at the same time we need to ensure that we protect and maintain our own cultural traditions.
Di indi teni nga zo teni perna teni to bu chong chong cho yenna inji chi go re te halipa karchim bo re te tang nyam de teni nga zo so teni ka tang ye te yenda man da chi go res.
So in respect of young children, whilst learning English is of course something that they need to do, at the same time they absolutely need to know and have proficiency in their own native language.
Teni pugu chong chong chola porko lob gona teni nga chola kangri orezi na kangri orezi ta teni lob taga nang la je pop paga teni porko jang sa lob tanda teni me teni yang sa ti so lob gona teni to kabli orezi.
Whether young children in American society find it difficult to learn Tibetan, well, of course, yes, there are challenges. Challenges, for example, having to go to schools, American schools, where the predominant language is English.
Kabli kanti yona ti thola teni suso teni ta kabli ti so par kangar ti so par khat sanni yinda manda teni ta katang yigi teni yakbo shiba tang teni poka rigni ti teni ta lichtur ti so re ta samlo ti so semka nala yakbo shinkan teni zi yong go res.
However, notwithstanding the challenges that exist, it's important that they be absolutely surmounted, and that young Tibetans learn the Tibetan language and also the Tibetan cultural tradition.
Teni te nge boba kyangpo se men se ngarang la samlo tana nga murig ranglik pas marezi teni pena boba yenari gyayenari nashok pas na so rang la rigni ramanda yore thama murig se na res.
In saying this, I'm not being an ethnic chauvinist, a nationalist, saying that this is the case for Tibetans alone. This is in fact a logic or a reasoning that applies equally to everyone.
Teni khabarta teni nga cho teni to bok teni to ti rigni to chu to nangba ga teni samlo ren do ji teni nangba ga samlo yin charti teni mo jan la teni chu to phan thoyang da ta mo jan la no pa ma she pa da o ta teni rigni ti tin na la shikchin yo re to yin na 정말로 판독거래 는데 디 인다만다 되니 르니도 랑그 르니도 많이 바시고 그래서
The importance, in particular to the Tibetan cultural tradition, stems from the fact that it is an embodiment of the Buddhist teachings, which are about benefiting others and not harming others. Thus, their particular importance to humanity.
되니 디 파마초고 인다만다 겐커고 그래서
This is a responsibility that parents really need to take on.
되니 디 돈당니 바인스
And this is my second point.
되니 돈다 선바디 강레제나 가서 사차 강당 강란 등나양 되니 사차 띠나니 페나가서 까블리 잠니 고르모 드브니 되니 고르모 테저라 송디 되니 띠나니 되니 카시서 되니 또 사차 띠나라 파르 되니 또 사차 띠멀나라 되니 파 판도야가나라 동고 그래서
The third point is that in our new place that we live, we need to use some of the wealth that we generate to benefit people in the immediate society in which we're living.
되니 아메리카 따위나 되니 또 참마 뭐식보 따다 말해야지 뭐 교부 된린도와 되나 되니 뭐 교부돼서 강나 요나양 되니 대소라 되니 로바시야 되니 지 고르모다 밤줄 거 통니 야침부스 요르고지나 테즈 카보 인게레타티 야치 총거 돈다 말해지 또 강타르 데 뇽뇽 르질레 메나양 강타르 가조되니 소소가 삼바티님 총야 체트 되니 또다 슈소고 가조 게레 스샷 되니 초판지나 풀리 어떠서고나라 양니 인다만다 지고래 가조양티 슈소콜레카티나라 참마 지고 그래서
American society is, after all, not just comprised of people who are wealthy. There are lots of poor people, so it's very important that we engage in work that supports charitable and welfare institutions. Of course, not necessarily in an extremely lavish way, but in accordance with our own means and capabilities.
야, 때돈다 선바레스 되니 텔레잠바 테랑 가서 다 대랑 그 차트도 되니 참조기엔 되니 참마가 야본 년송 지치스